So good afternoon, good evening, and a warm welcome to all of our attendees. Thank you for joining us today on this Straight Up Security webinar with Nutanix and Palo Alto Networks. My name is Adrian Liu. I'm the Alliances Director here at Nutanix for Networking and Security. I'll be your MC for today's session. Joining me today are two prolific speakers and experts in this field. We have Mike Wronski, who is the Director of Product Marketing at Nutanix, and Alex Berger, who's Head of Product Marketing for VM Series at Palo Alto Networks. So before we begin, got some housekeeping items for you to keep in mind. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A panel. We'll bring them up during the presentation, and we'll also have time for questions at the end as well. So before we begin, got some housekeeping items for you to keep in mind. If you have any questions at all during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A panel. We'll bring them up during the presentation, and we'll also have time for questions at the end as well. You'll also find links to today's slides and other useful materials under the resources widget to the left of the screen. So I suggest for you guys to take a look at that and download what looks interesting. Okay, over to you, Mike.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Adrian. And again, thank you to everyone that is joining us and to my co-presenter, Alex. And so Alex and I are going to run you through a number of things today, but you may be asking yourself, well, why is Nutanix on with Palo Alto? You may know Nutanix from the HCI hyperconverged space. I'm sure you know Palo Alto networking from security, next-gen firewall space. And you're asking yourself, how do we come together? Why is it that they're presenting together and having this session? And one of the key things that it brings us together is this idea of hybrid cloud. Hybrid cloud is becoming the operating kind of model of choice, where environments are looking to leverage the best of private cloud, the best of public cloud, and bring these two sides together so that they can really benefit operationally, as well as take the advantage of any performance gains from on-prem versus in the cloud, manage these environments based on security controls, et cetera. But within that environment, there are some challenges. We know that a lot of people are choosing it, but within that, there's a lot of concern over it's a little bit different. How do I ensure that what I've done in my on-premises data centers is going to match my cloud security and ensure that I'm not putting myself up to additional risk within that? And in the environment we're in today, risk is a big deal. We're seeing breaches, the cost of breaches go higher and higher. There's a new ransomware attack in the media just about every other week these days. And we really don't want our organizations to be caught up in any of these things. We know our data is valuable. It's either valuable from a data theft perspective, things like identity theft, or it's valuable from the ransomware perspective, where malicious users pretty much lock us out from our enterprise. And downtime can be very costly. And it can be costly from our operations, where I can't run my business, but it could also hurt me reputationally, meaning that customers are, well, gee, that company's not doing a really great job of protecting themselves or my information. Maybe I should take my business elsewhere. And there's a lot of research that confirms that there's that attitude in the market that it does damage you pretty heavily, and it takes some time to recover from that. So making a wild guess here that the majority of the attendees in this are in the IT space. You have these general concerns. You're either a virtualization practitioner, a security practitioner, maybe in the executive suite, and really want to get an idea of what can I do differently, or what are some of the tips and tricks to living in this new IT environment. And that's really what Alex and I are going to walk you through today. So first off, I want to talk a little bit more about hybrid cloud and what it is and why it can be a challenge. I think partially it has to do with, from a security perspective, is we're losing our notion of perimeters. And I've been a security, both sides of the fence. I've been in the vendor space as well as a practitioner in the healthcare space from an IT side. And when I started my career in security very early in the 90s, when it was fairly nascent, we had a pretty good idea of what perimeters were. Right? There was a door on the data center. You knew what the internet was. You had an edge gateway router, and you needed to have this kind of a logical concept of outside versus inside, trusted versus untrusted. So we could define these perimeters. I knew where my applications were. I could physically trace a wire and say, okay, this server goes to this database. This one goes to the switch. as we move into these hybrid cloud constructs, not only are our traditional data center architectures getting fairly complex, we've had virtualization for many years now, which abstracts out a lot of the ability to understand how things are going on. Now we throw in the idea of public cloud, SaaS offerings, all of these different connections and attributes of distributed data centers and distributed architectures add a lot of complexity to the environment. But they also make defining perimeters or defining security policy pretty hard to do. There's a lot of context that's required and interaction between different kind of traditional business silos, whether that's between virtualization, networking, and security admins and that kind of space. We throw into that this whole COVID pandemic, and now we have a huge group of people working from home. Does that change the model? A lot of remote access. Do I have the same security controls for each one of these users? And then we get to things like IoT and edge. And everything's connected to the internet. Between it's your refrigerator, toaster. I saw a internet-connected vent hood advertisement yesterday, which sounds completely ridiculous to me, but maybe somebody wants to understand, the flow of air from their vent hood and take pictures of their food while they're standing there. But in general, the point is everything's connected. Any one of these endpoints can be a vector for attack at some point. So a lot of complexity. So we need to get away from this perimeter concept, at least not the same kind of a perimeter concept. We like to start thinking of this as we define our perimeters really as policy-based, and it's really more of an application workload-centric idea to make sure that we can span these policies between our traditional side data centers and whatever we're doing in the hybrid cloud. And we're going to talk a little bit more about those kind of concepts here as we roll through this. So when we think about attacks themselves, a lot of sophistication going on. Many vectors, many vulnerabilities, everything, I've got a kind of a basic block chart here, and you don't even have to start from the top of this. It seems like there's a logical flow from the top when you port scanning and looking for vulnerabilities. But interestingly enough, hackers have many, many ways of infiltrating an environment. It could be through phishing attacks. It could be through social engineering, getting that first password section. So there's no one type of protection for any type of attack, and in that scenario, we really have to come up with an idea of making sure that we have, it sounds like, repeating something over and over again, but defense in depth is a tried and true idea in security. We need to revisit that. We need to make sure we are doing all of these, protection at multiple layers, looking at operating systems differently, looking at public cloud and private cloud differently to make sure we can cover this. And then we get inside the data center in areas when I talked about perimeter earlier. Things like ransomware and other malicious attacks happen because there's a lateral movement going on within the data center where I'm able to infiltrate maybe an unpatched web server at the edge or facing the internet. And from that, web server becomes a safe bastion for a malicious actor to go around and look for other vulnerabilities in the environment. So just to kind of nail that one down a little bit harder, making sure that we understand that there's a lot of attack sophistication coming from multiple vectors. So our security strategy should be just sophisticated and think about multiple vectors of protection within that. So what I've talked about here, kind of lay this out in a more effective way. What are the suggestions? What are the components to doing hybrid cloud security effectively? I think step one, we have to make sure we have granular visibility and control. And I started off mentioning about all the complexity here. So the visibility we're talking about is, hey, what are my applications? Which ones are connected through SaaS? Which ones are distributed using a public cloud and an on-prem component? Knowing what ports and protocols that they use to talk to each other. So, what's the expected good traffic for what's unnecessary? And that all starts with visibility of that environment, discovering applications, discovering where they communicate, understanding what's normal. And of course, then I want to be able to control that. Can I write policy to allow expected traffic, block all the unneeded things, et cetera, as a good baseline starting point. And then within that, though, we really need to have intelligent, comprehensive threat protection. And by this, I mean, can I identify anomalous behavior? Is there brute force attacking of passwords going on? Is someone repeatedly trying to port scan? Is there known attack code in packets traversing the good part of my network? Many times we can't always patch for certain security vulnerabilities, but the threat intelligence portion can identify attempts to use different vulnerabilities. So you're able to get through that if you have the right comprehensive intelligent threat protection. And then lastly, which is, I think, maybe one of the more overlooked aspects of a security strategy here is I want to eliminate the human factor. With all that complexity, it opens me up heavily to human error, how I can, neither, not necessarily maliciously, but if I don't understand a cloud infrastructure's security controls, maybe I configure them wrong. I know many of you have probably seen the news reports of data loss because of a misconfigured S3 bucket at Amazon. Happens all the time still, even though we see a lot of news about it. It's because it's complicated. There's many things. So if I can automate provisioning, application deployment, and as I scale out that as well, so that my VMs as a provision are in the appropriate configuration, my security controls are deployed in alignment with that. If I need to have more capacity for security controls, that flows and deployed automatically. Having that kind of automation and orchestration ensures that my policies, which may be fantastic, are actually being able to enacted and controlled in my environment. You may have heard a term out there for some of these controls and ideas in this change in removing that perimeter as a term called zero trust. And because it's such a prolific term, we wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit more. And at this point, I wanted to invite Alex Berger to come in. And Alex, can you talk to our audience a little bit more about zero trust and maybe give them a good kind of baseline understanding of what that is?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Absolutely. So good to be here. Let's talk a little bit about zero trust. So, at its core, zero trust is a model for protecting modern networks. And it's really become kind of the gold standard in the industry. To be honest, many of you on this call probably even have zero trust projects underway in your organizations that you're either involved in or are going on, in your security organizations. And if you're going to boil it down, the most foundational tenet of zero trust is actually pretty straightforward. You basically treat every user and every machine as untrusted. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at an analogy to help explain it. How do we protect a president using zero trust? To answer this question, we need three key pieces of information. First, we need to understand who the president is. Next, we need to understand where the president is. And finally, perhaps most importantly, we need to understand who should have access to the president. Once we have this information, we can design our zero trust defenses. So first, we define our protect surface. And we do this using our first piece of information, right? Once we know who the president is, we can establish our protect surface. This is the asset or assets that we need to protect. Once we understand who that, who those assets are, we can use our second piece of information, where they are, to establish a coarse-grained perimeter of sorts as kind of a first line of defense, right? So as Mike was saying a minute ago, this is becoming a little bit harder to define. The point here is less about it being a perimeter and more about being a coarse-grained kind of boundary, if you will, right? That is designed to keep out as much of the, low-hanging fruit, essentially, as possible. In the case of the president, to prevent people from, throwing a rock over the line, or to prevent people from, who are obviously malicious from gaining access. Once we have our coarse-grained perimeter here, we can start to get a little bit more specific. And the next step is to establish a microperimeter around our protect surface by deploying controls as close to the president as possible. Of course, in the president's case, it's the form of the Secret Service. Right? These controls ensure that anything that happens to get past the perimeter or exists within the perimeter can't simply interact with the president. Right? Again, we're going to assume that nothing is trustworthy. Now, we also employ additional controls to monitor for threats within the perimeter. And these controls can proactively intervene in the event that a threat is somehow lurking kind of in that in-between space, right? Not to mention the fact that the president isn't going to always stay inside their car. They might get out of the car. They're going to be in situations where they have to interact with other, people and other entities. And in those situations, we need some sort of control to protect the president, even in those types of situations, right? So this is kind of the in-between space. So this is essentially a zero trust model for securing a president. But what does that look like inside a data center or a hybrid cloud network. For this example, the VMs that we see on screen here are our assets that we want to protect, right? These are the presidents, if you will. The first thing, as we saw a minute ago, we want to do is establish a perimeter around them. And traditionally, we do this using a next-generation firewall of some kind, as well as other myriad point solutions at the perimeter of our networks, whether it's IPS systems or malware analysis solutions or things like that sitting at the edge of a data center or a public cloud environment for that matter. So first things first, we build our perimeter to catch the coarse-grained stuff. Next, we build our microperimeters. And we're going to do this using a tactic called microsegmentation. Microsegmentation effectively allows us to control traffic at the individual workload level. So we can granularly define what each workload is allowed to communicate with and what they're not allowed to communicate with. And as a result, we can ensure that only known, good, allowed communications are able to take place between two workloads in our environment. But because this is a real environment or representing a real environment and not just a fiction of our imagination, we know that invariably some of these solutions are going to have to, some of these workloads are going to have to be able to communicate with each other. So we're actually going to have to punch some holes in these microperimeters to allow workloads from different trust zones to communicate with each other. And when we do that, we want to pass that traffic through an additional layer of protection, right? This is the president getting out of the car and shaking hands with the public. We still need to make sure that we are inspecting every one of those interactions for some sign of a threat. And to do this, we layer in additional controls in between or at the boundaries of our microperimeters and trust zones to inspect our traffic a little bit deeper. This is where we're going to make sure that only allowed applications are traversing those boundaries and make sure that there's nothing malicious in the packets that are actually moving between trust zones in the environment. It's also critical that we are able to inspect encrypted traffic because oftentimes attackers will actually hide out in encrypted communication paths to avoid detection. So we need to be able to decrypt traffic where needed and inspect it deeply. I want to pause for a second on this notion of threat detection and threat prevention. Mike mentioned before that modern attacks are using lots and lots of different vectors throughout their entire life cycle, throughout their kill chain. And it's really important that we have the protections needed to address as many different vectors as possible in as many different phases of the attack as possible, because you never know what you're going to get faced with. And attackers are going to mix and match tactics. They're going to try different things. They're going to do reconnaissance in your environment to make sure that they have a good grasp on what will work, right? So, for instance, we should be able, and you'll notice that these tactics are actually taken directly from that attack example we were looking at earlier. So in the surveillance or intrusion phase of an attack, we need to be able to identify and prevent port scans. We need to make sure that brute force attacks are identified and mitigated. And today we have a number of different defenses to do this. Same thing for the escalation phase of the attack. We want to eliminate command and control activity, right? We don't want attackers to be able to maintain a connection with their command and control service or server. We want to, of course, prohibit them from moving laterally. And in the exploitation phase, we want to make sure that any attempt to download and execute malicious scripts or malware or ransomware is able to be identified and prevented before it's able to cause harm. So the point of this is to just show all the different ways, and this is by no means an exhaustive list here, but all the different ways that an attacker can combine tactics in your environment to cause damage. And we need a defense mechanism in place to address all of these. Okay, so we've talked about granular control and visibility with microsegmentation. We've talked about intelligent threat protection. The third component that we need is the ability to automate our protections. And when it comes to automation, there are really two things to think about. First, there is the automation of the security controls themselves and the deployment of those controls. We need to make it as easy as possible to get our controls into the environment to begin with. And ideally, we'll actually use the same infrastructure automation and orchestration tools to deploy security as we do for the infrastructure. We bake it directly into the process. Second, we need to make sure that as new workloads are dynamically created and deprecated throughout their life cycle, those workloads are automatically secured. The best way to accomplish this is actually to align our security policies with the native infrastructure tags of the environment itself, rather than aligning those policies to static workload attributes like IP address and port and protocol. These are some of the things we used to use when defining security policies. So this way, when a workload is spun up and tagged, its security policy is automatically applied based on that tag. This is what it looks like in practice. The security team, in collaboration with the infrastructure team, can deploy their controls into the environment. By integrating security deployment into your existing infrastructure provisioning workflow, you can ensure that your environment is automatically protected whenever you build out additional infrastructure in order to support your development teams. When the infrastructure team spins up new workloads, they should ensure that each workload is appropriately tagged. And by sharing this tagging in context with your security controls, the security team will actually be able to use it in their policy definition. So for instance, we could write a policy that says web servers should never communicate directly with database servers, or application servers should only be able to communicate using a specific application. Now, of course, in order to keep everyone on the same page, it's also important to have an integrated management plan. So with this, I want to pass it back to Mike to tell you a little bit how Palo Alto Networks and Nutanix actually deliver on the model that we just articulated.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Alex. And I definitely love the presidential analogy. Quite timely, considering what's going on in the country now. I'm sure everybody appreciated the explanation there. So, as we pull this through, I mean, it's not going to be a shocking surprise that we've been talking about that, we believe that Nutanix and Palo Alto Networks can help in this area. So as a solution, what we're talking about is how do we put this together? And it involves a couple of components. Integrated microsegmentation that is part of the Nutanix HCI and virtualization layer with product sections called Flow. Then we have the advanced threat protection from Palo Alto Networks and either where you're at Edge or more specifically the VM series running in the virtual space. And of course, automation orchestration from Nutanix Calm, allowing us to kind of tie all these things together with that goal in mind of getting, moving towards zero trust and be able to implement this kind of granular visibility and control policies that Alex and I just talked about. If we look at this on a familiar picture that Alex was just showing you, these pieces fit in fairly well. So we start off with Palo Alto Networks being your edge control there. Now this is my little bit more coarse-grained controls between at that perimeter level. Moving inside, a Flow providing that essentially host-based or endpoint virtual firewall that is how we deliver and implement microsegmentation environment, creating those kind of layer 3, layer 4 policies for connecting virtual machines and defining these different segments. And you saw in Alex's example, this could be application types. This could be some other segmentation for different business units. But essentially, you are creating these smaller contained communities of virtual machines that you're allowing specific communication from. And then, of course, inserting VM series in between when we need to allow, inspect that additional traffic there. So you're starting to get a very comprehensive picture of having multiple areas of inspection. So it fits into that traditional defense in depth model we talked about, as well as how do I get more towards zero trust and adding that into my microsegmentation. They're using microsegmentation to deploy that. And it all kind of comes together in this cloud-delivered security services. And then, Alex, maybe you could help me explain a little bit more about the different cloud security services that we can get when we have VM series deployed in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to. So the cloud-delivered security services from Palo Alto Networks are essentially a set of security services that you can enable on top of any of our firewalls, regardless of the form factor. So if you're using our hardware firewalls, our virtual firewalls, our container firewalls, or even our firewall as a service solution, cloud-delivered firewall, you can turn on our cloud-delivered security services, which are designed to protect you from all of those myriad different attacks that we were talking about before. So, we have a number of different services ranging from our threat prevention service, which is essentially an IPS. We have our URL filtering service, our wildfire malware analysis service. We have a specific DNS security service. We've got, the sky's the limit in terms of the number of these services that we have to protect you from all the different myriad attack vectors that you need to be protected from. And the beauty of the cloud-delivered security services is that they deploy directly on top of the firewalls. So instead of having to rely on a number of discrete, separate point solutions to protect you from all the different attack vectors we've been discussing today, these all deploy directly on top of the firewalls themselves. You don't have to spend a lot of time managing additional solutions or worrying about how you're going to deal with an overly complicated solution portfolio or security posture. You simply can enable these directly on the firewalls. So that's really the crux of the cloud-delivered security services, and they're just there to protect you from as many of those different vectors as we possibly can.
Yeah, that is excellent. Thank you, Alex. And I think this, hopefully the audience is starting to understand it. This really starts to become almost a software-defined solution in many ways. You're leveraging the different cloud delivery security services that make sense. You can use Nutanix Flow to create microsegmentation, as well as decide what traffic you want to route through those cloud delivery services that Palo Alto is offering. And that's, I think, that's an important point I wanted to make sure we make here, is that the integration that we're talking about here, you might have thought, well, gee, I could just, why don't I just buy some Palo and deploy some microsegmentation and be done with it? But it doesn't solve the operational problem of doing this. You really want to have that automation side that I talked about. And it starts with the policy section, being able to decide what part is microseg, and then being able to be very prescriptive about what traffic I want to route through the VM series for that additional threat inspection. So as we talk a little bit more about that automation side, again, I'll start with an image that Alex used, kind of showing our idea between the ideal integration workflow. And I can populate this with the components that are part of the solution. So I think a great benefit of our integrated solution here is that we have a single automation tool integration point that is leveraged by different or multiple audiences. Depending on your organization size, you may be the virtual admin and the security admin. So that's, that makes things a little bit easier. But as the organizations get larger, we know that there are different people that have different roles, and that integrated management plane becomes important. And Calm is that for us. So it starts off with making sure that we have easy to deploy blueprints in Calm. Allows me to pick and set up in a scale out fashion the ability to deploy VM series across my network for those security admins, and scale that up as my environment scales. So as I'm adding more and more Nutanix HCI, and I need more capacity and I need more inspection points, I have an automation framework to point, click, and ship, for an example, and get these items deployed. And then on the opposite side, and I talked a lot about the repeatability of this. So as my virtual machines are being deployed, I want to have blueprints for my applications, whether that's kind of a basic LAMP stack of Linux and databases and a web front end, or more complex application stacks. Having this blueprint that defines where VMs should live. Which is it on-prem or in a public cloud environment, or in something like Nutanix clusters that runs in public clouds like AWS and Azure, but also apply that appropriate context through tagging or categorization of applications, and having multiple tags in multiple categories so that those policies can be applied appropriately, and providing context to both sides. And in that previous image, and I wasn't going to go back to it, but once we have this shared context between the security admin and the virtual admin, you can expand that context. So not only are we talking about the segmentation that Nutanix is providing for microseg, these tags and metadata allow us to decide what information must be passed over for additional threat inspection to the VM series. But that context can also be used by any of the other Palo Alto infrastructure that's protecting your environment. And the idea of that integration between all these tools and up through the Nutanix management plane and the Palo Alto management plane really ties all of this together for what essentially becomes an easily repetitive cycle for consistent application of policy, and ensuring that you've eliminated as much human error as possible, and preventing these threats, and definitely limiting your blast radius or exposure by moving more and more towards having this kind of a zero trust environment for using microseg and the categorization here. So I wanted to kind of roll through a quick summary of the benefits of this integration. I think much like Nutanix and HCI and the hyperconvergence side, we're always looking for ways to make sure that we make it as easy as possible for our customers to operate what becomes very complex environments. And this applies to security as well. And that's why we're here with Palo Alto in this great integration to make it very simple for you to easily add additional security controls and increase your kind of security posture without tons of hurdles. You're not having to do complex deployments. We've pretty much automated all of that for you through the CALM framework and get that done. It also extends, like I said, to hybrid clouds. We started talking about hybrid clouds here. Nutanix has Nutanix clusters, which lets you run Nutanix infrastructure in AWS or Azure very shortly, and we're going to be expanding out to other public cloud entities. Anywhere you have Nutanix deployed, multiple data centers, your own public ones, these policies are pervasive everywhere. So you're kind of a set once and deploy everywhere construct, which really does fit into that hybrid cloud model. And of course, allowing you to extend this into the additional controls that Palo Alto provides. I think microsegmentation, I would say, is the early steps, but we do have to make sure that we're looking at these, the complexity of the additional threat vectors that even allowed traffic can be leveraged by a malicious actor. So it is a comprehensive solution. You need to use both halves of or both parts of the solution to deliver the most effective option.
Thank you, Mike and Alex. That was excellent information. Appreciate the overview on Zero Trust and how Nutanix and Palo Alto Networks addressed this challenge. So here you'll see a list of items here where you can learn more about our joint solution, some links here, and then how you can get started actually deploying this. And all this information is on www.nutanix.com/PANW. You can go there. Some really cool assets on there too that'll have all these plus more as well too. So now we have Q&A session. We've got a few minutes here. So I'd like to open up a Q&A. As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. So first one I have is Palo Alto VM series required to make the Zero Trust model work fully? I'll let Mike, you want to take that, or Alex?
We probably can tag team. The short answer I would say is yes. Really, because when we talk about Zero Trust, and so if you think about Nutanix is offering microsegmentation, so we can make sure we're limiting the traffic down to what's required for your application to function. But as I mentioned near the end, and Alex covered this as well, malicious actors can leverage allowed traffic. So if you're allowing your application servers to talk to a Postgres database, and there's a known vulnerability in Postgres databases, we always assume that at some point in time, some security measure is going to fail. Someone's going to get in through a missing patch or some other method. So that's where threat intelligence and that layer 7 inspection comes in. I don't know if you had anything else you want to add to that, Alex.
No, that was bang on, Mike. I mean, I think, the way to think about this is as many layers as defense as possible will get you the strongest posture you can have, right? And Mike put his finger on it a second ago when he was talking about allowed traffic. That's where the VM series really comes into play. And the reason we're talking about a VM series and not a PA series, which is our hardware firewall, is simply because the virtual form factor allows us to get closer to the traffic in virtualized environments than a hardware firewall would. We don't want to be in a situation where, you're hairpinning traffic from your virtual infrastructure out to a physical box sitting out on the edge of your data center, and then back in, particularly if you're talking about situations where that traffic is moving between two virtual machines on the same hypervisor, for instance, the same host. So the VM series, the virtual form factor of our firewall, allows you to insert that layer 7 traffic inspection and all of those threat protection mechanisms in line directly into the virtualized environment. So yeah, it definitely is required to give you the strongest Zero Trust posture that you can have.
Excellent. Mike, I'll let you take this one. Does this joint solution work with any hypervisor?
So I guess the answer to that is definitely not at this point in time. So if those of you familiar with Nutanix may know that we do support multiple hypervisors in Nutanix world, as we understand that there are many different types of environments out there and legacy infrastructure and preferences. But we're really talking about here is use of Nutanix's AHV hypervisor, which is something that we include with our platform. And it is an enterprise-grade virtualization platform. That's where the flow component is integrated deeply into the virtualization layer. And as Alex was just mentioning, it's important to have this virtualization integration so that we can get very close to the workloads and avoid just the complexity of that hairpinning example or having to route traffic around. I remember in the days of having to do like VLAN translation and things for moving things between an IPS, IDS, all fraught with potential availability issues or human error. So by putting this in a software-defined solution, linking it down to our AHV hypervisor, we feel we're giving you the best possible performance and operating model. So if this solution itself does only work with Nutanix and AHV, but from a practical perspective, I'm sure there are other solutions out there that can integrate similar to this. And if you're using those, really reach out to the teams of Palo Alto or Nutanix, and we can have those more specific discussions about other hypervisors or other options.
Great, thanks. Another question, are there future integrations in the works to secure end-to-end solutions? I can take this. So in addition to what you learned today, there are other parts of the infrastructure that Palo Alto Networks and Nutanix are working on exploring it together. For example, secure SD-WAN for robo use cases with CloudGenix. Mike mentioned clusters on AWS earlier for hybrid. Also looking at security solution with containers with Palo Alto Networks Prisma and Nutanix Carbon. And we'll be delivering playbooks with the Cortex XOR for security orchestration and automation. Let's see. And then I think we have one more question. I think we're running a little bit over here. Let's see. I'm interested in learning more about Flow and VM series and seeing a demo. Who should I contact? Suggestion is if you're a Nutanix customer, reach out to your Nutanix sales representative, and they'll get you in touch with the right security experts. And if you're a Palo Alto customer, likewise, I'm sure we'll connect. And if it's neither, I think just go to the nutanix.com/contact-us link and just fill in there, and we'll, a solutions expert will get in touch with you, and we can start exploring that as well too. Okay, I think that was it. So we'd like to thank all of you for attending this Straight Up Security webinar with Nutanix and Palo Alto Networks.